Welcome back to another TD Ameritrade Python API library video. Okay, so we are going to talk about a little bit more about the streaming API. Over the weekend, I made some changes to the library to integrate some new enhancements to that particular client aspect of the library. So what you will now be able to do are probably two really big things, which is A, you will be able to unsubscribe from certain services when you want. So you just have to define the logic in that code. The other big change is I have built the initial framework for leveraging a pipeline. So some type of data pipeline where what you can do is you subscribe to your services, you're going to start streaming, and then what the pipeline will do is it's going to pass back the data to you. So what that means is as the data comes in, it's going to be returned to you. And then on your end, you're going to have to define what you want to do with that data once it's there. Now, working with this pipeline is going to require us to leverage some libraries we talked about when we were developing the library. So a big one is the async IO library. And then eventually down the road, we will do examples where we take this data and we can put it into a database. So I've actually done code like that already. I actually have one client I am working with where I am currently putting that data into a database as it comes in. And so it very much is doable. So that means as the data comes in, it goes directly into an Azure instance of a SQL database. However, if you want to leverage this new functionality, you do need to make sure you upgrade the library if you currently have it. Obviously, if you don't have the library, you're going to have to install it. So I did put some commands up here. So if you want to install the library, it's pip install TD Ameritrade Python API. And for this particular version of the library, you're going to want 0.2.6. If you already have it installed, you can just run pip install --upgrade and then the name of the library. So TD Ameritrade Python API. I'm going to change the coloring because I think it might be a little bit hard to read. Where is it? We'll turn it to the light one. There we go. So those are your options when it comes to if you want to either upgrade the existing version or install a brand new version. So with that being said, I will show you kind of what the final product will look like. And then once you kind of see it, we'll then start going into the process of actually writing the code. So here is what our new data pipeline will look like. So this is all still the same. So you still would create a new session like you've always done. You would still create a new instance of the streaming client like you always have. And you would still subscribe to services just like you always would. So what this will still be the same. Now, what you're going to be doing is if you want to leverage the pipeline, you're going to create a new asynchronous function, and you can call it whatever you want. In my case, I just call it data pipeline. And then inside that particular pipeline, you will call your streaming client and you'll call the build pipeline method. So this will basically do the login request, submit the data request, and all that kind of fun stuff. And then you're going to wrap basically what you want to have happen during that pipeline as data is coming in a while statement. And so inside this while statement, basically what's going to keep happening, it's going to keep happening until something happens that stops it. And then you're going to grab your data. And then once you have your data, it's just like anything else. So now you've got this dictionary component. You can handle that dictionary however you want. So that's basically what's going on. And then I've also built in some logic to show you how to unsubscribe and then also at the same time closing the stream. So I also did make some changes to closing the actual streaming client because for the most part, that was relatively challenging to do for most people. There wasn't really good functionality there. I never really had built it in a solid fashion. but hopefully with these latest changes, you should see a more graceful close of the streaming client, but it will require that you define certain logic in your code. So you basically have to tell that particular stream, when should I close? What are the criteria that I need in order to close? Again, we'll walk through an example and we'll talk through it. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to import some libraries. The first one, and probably the most important one, is the async IO library. So this is a nice way where we can write concurrent Python code. And then I will be printing some data, and the pretty print module does a great job of doing that. And then we're going to have a config file. Again, the config file, hopefully at this point, I've mentioned it enough times, you have to create that. I will not be creating that for you. You do not have to have a config file. What you could do is, if you want, you could put these variables inside the script that I'm currently in, but you need to make sure then that if anyone else sees it, that you trust them, because obviously if you don't trust them, then they now have access to your consumer key and all that kind of fun stuff. Also called your client ID. So again, I will not be providing a config file for you. That's your responsibility. You can create a config file and you can put the variables in there. And I do have examples on my GitHub, so you're more than welcome to use those. Otherwise, you put them in the script itself. From here, we are going to import our TD client, and in this case, it's going to be the TD client object. And then we're just going to create a new session. And so what we'll do is we'll say TD session equals the TD client. And then you'll notice here we have our nice little doc string. So this was something I added so that way people have a nice clear idea of how to do it. And then you'll also now see examples under the usage component, how to use this particular thing. So at a bare minimum, I need at least 2 components if you are not using a credentials path. That is client ID and redirect ID. Account number is there. I don't technically need it in really anything. Again, that's there in case maybe down the road we do something. And then credentials path. So in this case, I will put in my client ID. That will just equal my consumer ID or consumer key. I sometimes in other videos call that the client ID. They are the same exact thing, and definitely not a recursion error. And then the next one will be my credentials path. Again, in some videos, I call it JSON path. It's up to you. But again, these are just variables, nothing fancy behind them. Okay, and then we're going to log in to the session. Fun. So we're going to call TD session, and then we're going to call that login method that will log in, and it will do the entire authentication process for us. From here, we are then going to do and create a new streaming session, or really a new instance of the streaming client. And so here we're going to call it TD streaming client. That will equal our TD session. There will be a create streaming session. And then from here, you can see there's also some usage on how to use this particular method. So again, you would just create your session, log in, and then you can create a streaming session. There are no arguments that have to be passed through. Again, the client will be sent back to you. And then from here, we now are going to basically subscribe to the services that we want. And so in this case, I want level 1 quotes. So we're going to do TD streaming clients, and then it's going to be the level 1 quotes endpoint. And then from here, oh, I did level 2 quotes. I don't want level 2 quotes. I want level 1 quotes. Level 1 quotes. And you can see here, I've also now added type hinting inside the services to subscribe to them. I will be working on the doc strings next, but right now, at least you should have some kind of idea of how these arguments need to be passed through. In this case, I want SPY, and then I want, what is it? We'll do AAPL, and then we'll do Tesla, and then we'll do Square. So you can do multiple symbols at once. There's nothing stopping you from doing that. And then from here, I will put in the fields that I want. In this case, again, we've talked about the fields. So they do have to be put in sequential order. So you can't just have, 0 through 5 and then 15 through 20. You have to have, if you want to do something like that, where you had 0 and 5 and 15 through 20 would have to be, unfortunately, 0 through 20. So there is no way around that. So what that's really kind of debating in my mind is, should I even give you the option to pass through list? But at this point, I think I'm probably going to keep it, but I'll probably also have a default option, which basically says if you don't provide anything, I'm just going to give you everything. So that's level 1 quotes. And then we'll also do level 1 futures. So futures data, and then we'll do the TD streaming client, and then we'll do level 1 futures. And then again here, it's again very much the same. We're going to have our symbols. Now in this case, because we're doing futures, remember futures have to have that / in front of the symbols. Otherwise, you will get back, in some cases, equities. And then so let's do oil. I don't know if that will be of any use. And then we'll also put in our wonderful fields list. In this case, we'll just keep it at 50. I think futures has 50 fields. I haven't honestly checked. We'll find out in a sec. So normally, this is how you would use the client. So you would say, okay, TD streaming client, and then you would do the stream method. I did change one of the keyword arguments to print to console instead of print because it was causing some issues behind the scenes because it was kind of basically like a Python keyword. So I have changed that. Again, you don't normally have to specify that because by default, it's true. So if you want to see the output on your terminal, you would actually, you wouldn't specify anything. You would just kind of keep it as is. But you can see data is flowing in. I've also reformatted the messages a little bit to make them just a tiny bit more readable. Unfortunately, for streaming, and it's depending on what you've subscribed to, you could potentially get a lot of data coming back. So it's not going to really matter. So that was normally how you streamed data, right? So at that point, if you wanted to, you could also specify write behavior, anything like that. People, for some people that was more than okay, but at a certain point, people are going to want to be able to grab the data as it's coming in. So if you want to start thinking about this concept of a pipeline, which is the data comes in, you're processing it, and then maybe you're putting it into a database, or maybe you're putting it somewhere else where maybe down the road you will be using that data. So in this aspect, we can start thinking about a pipeline where data comes in and it goes out. So the main thing that you need to understand about the streaming client is behind the scenes, there is a lot of asynchronous Python that is going on, right? And so when you're going into this realm of building a pipeline, you're going to have to understand a couple things. There is some complexity. That complexity is really kind of driven by the fact of you have to know what's asynchronous and what's not asynchronous and what you have to wait for before moving on to the next step. Because normally with normal Python code, it executes pretty straightforward. Execute this line, execute this line, execute this line, execute this line, and then so on and so on. With asynchronous Python, now we're saying, well, execute this line, but if you're telling me not to wait, or basically if you're saying, hey, wait, you can now move to the next line before this one technically sends you anything back. Sometimes that's advantageous because in certain situations, we have a lot of input output. So there's a lot of waiting that's going on behind the scenes. And so this is one way we can speed up our Python programs, is saying, hey, while you're waiting for that data to come in, go and do some other things. Now that's assuming that you want to wait, or sorry, that you want to go on. In some cases, what we actually want to have happen is we want to wait for that data to come in, and then we're going to pass it through and start processing it. But then we can kind of go back and have the next round of data come in and be ready to process it. So because we're now in this world of this asynchronous kind of programming, we now have to write our functions in a little bit of a different fashion. So really at the core of it, you're going to have a function somewhere in your script. And so really we're going to say is we're just going to define a function that will handle the data pipeline. So this is kind of our main pipeline function. It's very important that you precede the the DEF, or the definition of our function, with async. The reason why is because inside of this particular pipeline, we are going to be using the await keyword. And what that basically will do is it will say, hey, wait for something to happen before going on to the next step. If we want to use that keyword, we have to have an asynchronous function. So that's very important that when you're building your pipeline, you always proceed it with async. Additionally, we will be passing through this function to an async IO event loop. So we'll be running it on an event loop. So when we pass it through to async IO, we have to give it an asynchronous function to run, because what we're telling async IO is we're going to be having a function where in some cases we will want our script to keep kind of running, or different parts of our script to keep running behind the scenes while we're doing other things. So while that one's waiting, you can go and do other things in our function. That's really the core of it. The core of it is, in some part of my script, I'm going to say, hey, while I'm waiting for something, go and do some other stuff, right? So don't wait for me to, finish doing something. You can go and start doing the other thing. The benefit is your script's going to run faster, but in some cases you have to do that because in some cases the previous task might never finish. So for example, if I'm waiting for my streaming client to finish sending data before I go on and, process it, well, guess what? I have to make sure that it has to finish first. And some of these streams run all day long. So what will happen is that task of receiving the data will never finish because it never actually finished that process. It was happening pretty much all day long. So what this will allow us to do is we don't have to wait for that to finish as the data comes in. We can say, hey, keep going back, grabbing the data and then processing it. So really, in high level view, that's what's kind of going on behind the scenes. Now, this is a relatively advanced topic. So, probably next week, I'm going to start dedicating some time to talking about this idea of asynchronous programming. And then I think on top of that is, where does that fit in to this bigger picture? Like, why do we even use it? So that's really for a separate time, but I'm trying to give you an idea of why we're doing what we're doing. It's really because this streaming client is built in such a way where in some cases, other parts of the code will be executing while the other ones are waiting for stuff. So that's really the core of it. So once you've defined your pipeline, you can then start doing certain things with it. So one thing what we're going to do is we're going to build the pipeline. So we're going to take our client object, and you'll now find a build pipeline method. And then this will return a WebSocket client. And really that's just our connection to our WebSocket. And it will do different things. So it will log you in. I think this one's only the one that logs you in. So this is basically getting the session created. And then when we start the pipeline, that's where we submit our request. Now here, we are going to build the pipeline. You might be asking, why do I use await? What I'm saying is, before you go on to the next part of the code, you need to make sure that this finishes. So this has to finish before you go on to the next part of the code. Then from here, what we're going to do is we're basically going to kind of define this framework, which is keep going as long as we can receive data. So we're going to say while true. So basically right now I just have an infinite loop because this will keep going forever until at some point I say false or I say break. I have to somehow say stop this while loop. Right now I haven't defined that. So this will just keep going forever. So what we're going to do from here is we're going to now start the pipeline. Start the pipeline. And what this will look like is we're going to say data will equal await TD streaming client start pipeline. So this is what's going to actually be handing us back data. And so it will return a dictionary that contains your data that's coming in from your WebSocket. So all I've done here is I said, hey, start the pipeline as the data comes in, store it in this variable called data. Now from here, I can start processing the data because it's been given back to this script. So the script that I'm currently writing in. Now you just treat it however you want to treat it. So say, for example, we only want to work with it if there's data inside of it. So only parse it if there is data. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, if data, so the key data is in that data dictionary, do something. What is that something you want me to do? Well, it depends, right? In this case, let's just keep it simple. We'll print it out. So I'll put this little thing here and we'll say, okay, print out the data. Okay, data content is going to equal the data dictionary. I know there's a data key in it because I wouldn't be in this part of the if statement if it wasn't there. And I know, for at least from my experience, that the data dictionary tends to be a list of data, right? So if I go in here and I look at my responses and I say, okay, look, okay, so it's in my content. Okay, great. So there's a bunch of basically content inside of it. And so there can be often a list of content. And so what I'm gonna say is, okay, great. If there's data, then grab the first item in that data list because I might have multiple subscriptions. And so in this case, grab the first subscription and then grab the content from that subscription. That's really what I'm doing. And then from here, what I want you to do is make it where we can see the data. So we'll say pretty print, and then we'll say data content. And then you know what? I want it to be indent 4. So just make it where it's a little bit easier to read. That's all. So I've grabbed the data and I've printed it. So I am now currently manipulating the data. Now from here, what I'll do is I will print out the bottom portion of it. And from here, we've kept it really simple. We haven't talked about unsubscribing and we haven't talked about closing the stream, but let's see what it would look like at this point. So what is our stream going to look like? Because technically at this point, you have enough to start a data pipeline. It's never going to finish or you're never going to close, but you do technically have enough to start a pipeline. So now I need to run the pipeline because I've defined it, but I've nowhere specified where to start running it. So now we're going to take our async IO library and there is a run method. And so this one will execute the coroutine and return the result. So our coroutine basically is that async function. And once it starts it, it will, manage the event loop. It will do all that kind of fun stuff. And it will just keep going in this particular regard. And so you can kind of see here, they have some examples where they use the asynchronous component of it. So all they're doing is they're saying, hey, you define your function and then you're gonna run your main function. Now in my particular function, I wrote it in a very specific way where it will never end because of that while loop. So very important that you understand that currently the way I have it, there's no way for this to end unless I just physically kill the script. So let's run it. And let's hope it doesn't break, right? Oh, good, it didn't break. Wonderful. So you can now see it's starting to print data as it's coming in. And I know that it's printing it in the script that I've defined because it's printing it in such a formatted fashion. I told it to do that. So this is just validating that I am controlling the data as it's coming in. That data has now been handed off to me, which I can then use. So I'm going to kill the script because right now it won't actually finish. However, what we'll do from here is we will now move on to, maybe manipulating the data a little bit more. So in this case, I have my content and I know I have data keys that are going to be in here. So say, for example, I want, where's my level 1 quotes? I want my keys, for example, right? Or I want maybe my field 40, I guess, if that's one way to think about it. So here I can grab some of the content as it's coming in. So I can say, for example, print, here is my key. And we'll say dot format, and then we'll do data content, and then we'll do 0, and then we'll do key. Because again, the content is for a particular service. For some services, in fact, both of these services right now, I have multiple symbols I'm streaming for. So I have to specify what symbol do I want from that service content. So I'm saying, give me the first symbol and give me the key of that first symbol. That's how you want to think about this one. So this will do that. And then from here, I am now going to define a new variable up at the top of my data pipeline. And I'm going to call it data response count. And I'm going to initialize it at 0. Inside my data response, I am going to say, okay, data response count plus equal 1. So I'm just going to increment it by 1 as I receive more and more data. So this is important because I can now use this as logic to determine how my script should behave at different parts of my pipeline. So say, for example, I say, hey, if the data response count is equal to, let's say, 10, then what I want you to do is I want you to unsubscribe from a particular service. So I'm going to say, okay, unsub response is going to equal, I'm going to call my await keyword, and I'm going to say streaming client. And now you will see there's an unsubscribe method. And it takes one argument at this point, and that is the name of the service that you want to unsubscribe from. At some point, I will probably have an enumeration component to the TD library where you'll have all the service names. So that way you can easily reference them, because I don't know about you, but I don't remember all of them. But from here, what you want to know is this will unsubscribe from a service that you specify. And then it does return a response. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to then print that response. I'm going to say, okay, equals times 80. And then I'm going to say, okay, also print the unsub response. And then also just print it so that way I can see a nice little line break. I feel like I'm on Criminal Minds, unsub. So here, once we have 10 data responses, we no longer need level 1 futures. So all this is showing us is we can unsubscribe from content as it comes in. As it comes in, we can unsubscribe from content dynamically. You can define the logic in the sense of whatever you want it to be, however complex or however simple you want it to be. You can always, have a mechanism to unsubscribe. Note, I did also use the await keyword. Why is that? Well, I definitely don't want to print out the response if it's not given to me. So the await keyword says, hey, wait until this finishes, and then store it in this variable unsub response that you will then print. So let's see how this new component changes the behavior of our particular pipeline. Because at some point we should see now an unsubscribe response. So you can see here, it's printing that key as the data is coming in. Keep in mind, I did change it up here, so it's not going to print everything. Oh, great. Look at that. It unsubscribed from that service, and now we are no longer seeing the data as it's coming in. So very cool that we have now unsubscribed, and now it's showing us the level 1 quotes. And there's a very big reason for that one, which is beforehand it was the futures was actually coming in first. So that was the first part of all of our content. The second part is the quotes. So at this point, this is showing us we can now unsubscribe dynamically inside of our script based on certain logic. Finally, we want to talk about the next thing, which is what happens if the data response count is, say, I don't know, 20, right? So if it's 20, what do we want to have happen? In this case, I actually want to close my stream. So I actually want to close everything out. I say, you know what, I've got enough data for the day. I'm going to close the stream. And then you say, okay, great. So I'm going to close it. So I'm going to say await TD stream, close stream. And then I need to do something very important, which is break from my while loop, else it will still keep going. Once we have 20 data responses, we no longer need to stream data. That's really kind of what's going on here. So all I've done is I've just added another condition, and I'm still doing the close stream, and I'm also still doing the await keyword. It's very important that you do await, because otherwise this won't finish. You want that to finish. So I'm going to keep going and see what happens. And you're like, okay, great. So now we're going to see what happens again. So at 10, we should see it be unsubscribed. And then at 20, we're going to see, hopefully, the stream close. So you can now see, okay, great. So it's doing all that stuff. You're like, okay, wonderful. I got my data. It's coming in. And then at some point, it will close. Great. So now, connection with server closed, beginning close process, the event loop was closed. So this was also talking about, I'm trying to make the closing process more graceful. So hopefully this will now make that process a little easier and a little bit clearer about like, okay, so it's finished, it's done. And now I don't have to just, kill my script in order to kind of get it to work the way I need it to work. So with that being said though, you basically have enough to kind of go and be free, or, go and start making some scripts that do different things. Again, this isn't going to solve everyone's different problems. There's obviously a lot of different ways you can handle data. I know a big thing is databases. People are going to want to see how to put into databases. I will dedicate some time at some point to doing that. More than likely, it's going to be with PyODBC, but I will also probably talk about a probably non-PyODBC library example. I will want to talk something probably about maybe SQL Alchemy or something like that to see how we can take this data and put it into a database. I can promise you it definitely does work, because again, I am doing it for one of my clients where he wants it streaming into an Azure database as it comes in, which has been very interesting. It's very neat to kind of see it. He's doing it with all this like trading robot stuff. It's been very interesting. So at this point, if you got any questions, by all means, put them down in the comments below, and I will do my best to hopefully answer them for you. Otherwise, yeah, next video probably related to this will be on inserting into a database. And then, really for the most part, that's going to kind of wrap up the TD library stuff for a while until, maybe new things are added, stuff like that. I think from there, we'll probably start moving on more to interactive brokers, just focusing on that one for the time being. They also have a web streaming component as well, so we'll want to be looking through that. And then also just looking through some examples on the library, and then possibly doing, more order examples and stuff along that nature. And then obviously our trading robot that will be done, that's going to be using the TD API. So that's kind of the plan with that one. So thank you again for watching, everybody. We'll see you in the next video.